All right. Good evening. This is the latest installment of Building the Scottish State, and I have the great pleasure to have with me MP Philippa Whitford with me to talk about several issues this evening. So, first of all, thank you for being with us.
You're very welcome.
I wanted to start. I received a very pleasant surprise the other day because I was going through I saw some Scottish currency notes up on the social media, and I went to that, and apparently it's bills for the Scottish Reserve Bank, and I went to the site and I found a timeline that says that on Thursday, 9th of September 2021, Scotland will vote in a second referendum. And I was wondering if you had any insight into that. I mean, is that part of the...
I don't think so. I think it would be a good time. It would be 7 years since our last independence referendum in September 14. And the only, all this once in a generation stuff is complete nonsense. It wasn't in the Edinburgh Agreement. And all the major parties signed the Smith Commission report after the referendum. And that very clearly said there is nothing in this report that stops Scotland becoming an independent country in the future, should her people so choose. So they signed up to that after the referendums. The whole once in a generation is nonsense. But the only legal timing between generations is set in the Good Friday Agreement. Mm-hmm. And that says that the people of Northern Ireland can have a border poll no closer together than every 7 years. Mm-hmm. And obviously part of that is that you would have two general elections or two elections between that, which means that you can assess that a wish to have that is a consistent wish in the population, not just something driven by some kind of flash outcome. Well, we've had three general elections. We're about to have our second Holyrood election. We've had local elections and European elections, and the SNP have won all of them since that referendum. So, I think we basically meet the tenets of that. So to me, that would be quite a good time. It also means that the campaigning would just literally keep going after the election. But this is way above my pay grade. So no, there's nothing secret that I know. I just would love it to be next September.
Because I was chatting with Gordon McIntyre Kemp, and he said that this was very likely be in the manifesto for the Holyrood elections in May. And they would campaign on both the new currency and the specific date of this one. So let's hope. That's all I can say.
I mean, I don't know about that as a date being in the manifesto. I mean, I haven't seen any of the proposals for the manifesto as yet, but I think there is no question that certainly an independence referendum independence will be front and center of that manifesto, whether it's got a specific currency or anything else. And frankly, I don't know. But I'm not in any doubt that our right to independence and our right to choose. And that's the key thing. I don't expect Labour or the Tories or anything to campaign for independence or give us an easy ride, though I have to say Labour would have a better future if they did, particularly when 40% of their supporters actually support independence. But the idea that they should deny us the right to make our own decision, that's the thing. It's so utterly undemocratic.
Okay. And tell me a little bit about about your life in Westminster or away from Westminster, and how are the logistics of that going? We were talking about it a little bit earlier, but with regard to voting, with regard to just working from home, working from a distance, how has that been functioning?
Well, obviously, we went into lockdown kind of third week in March, and the Easter break, the Easter recess came kind of quite quickly, really, on top of that at the end of March. And by the time we came back, the digital department in Westminster had actually done a fantastic job. They had the ability for us to contribute virtually in the chamber. They had big TV screens up. They had set up electronic remote digital voting, which was quite an achievement. And all of that, we have a virtual protected network. I mean, we're signing in with a password, we have dual authorization, all sorts of security measures to get in. And they were using that also for the people in the chamber, so that we weren't doing that kind of trawling through the lobbies. And as someone who was not attending Westminster, I could take part in everything other than legislative committees. So I could take part in debates, I could take part in the legislative debates, but just not in where it had to go to a committee room. And then basically Rees-Mogg shut it all down at the end of May. There was the debate on the 2nd of June about having at least something for those of us who couldn't attend Westminster. And the most shocking thing was they had a 90-minute debate on virtual access to Parliament, and those of us who couldn't attend were excluded. They already applied the physical attendance only, physical voting only rule to that debate. So my understanding is it's well over 100 MPs who, of course, would have voted to continue the hybrid parliament were excluded from the debate that made that decision. So since then, I've been able to take part in things like parliamentary questions and urgent statements. But we had a medicines and medical devices bill. Kindly, one of the Labour frontbenchers laid amendments and new clauses for me, but I couldn't take part in it. I couldn't take part in the bill committee. So I had to go down a couple of weeks ago because I had a private member's bill, which would have had to be withdrawn if I didn't physically attend, and I was able to speak in the internal market bill. But I find it outrageous that there are so many MPs excluded when the digital setup and technology had already been put into place. And particularly now with numbers rising and going into the winter, the idea that you're going to be pulling 600 MPs up and down from all over the UK in the middle of this pandemic, it's just utterly bonkers.
Is it just, in your view, is it just a deliberate on their part to disenfranchise many MPs, particularly people who come from Scotland?
It doesn't just disenfranchise us. I mean, it's particularly MPs who are shielding, MPs who have someone in their family who's shielding or high risk. So those are the people who really, and obviously older MPs over 70, many of them just simply can't, they can't attend. Obviously, for all of us from Scotland or the very north of England or Northern Ireland, where we have quite long journeys to make, that journey itself is dangerous. You're spending, 4 or 5 hours on a train, or you're sitting in a plane and, all the seats are full. So you're completely surrounded by people you don't know. And the only protection is that you have a face covering on. But other than that, all the seats in the plane when we flew down 2 weeks ago were all occupied. Yeah. So, I think, to me, I think it's the traditionalists. I think it's Rees-Mogg. They have a nostalgia for, the debating and the shouting and all this kind of stuff. And I think particularly at the beginning, Boris Johnson was looking very lost at Prime Minister's questions without a kind of group of cheerleaders. So I think a lot of it was that. But of course, you can still only have 50 MPs in the chamber. So you can't change that. It's still less rowdy and less noisy and doesn't have the atmosphere. I mean, as somebody said to me, if you're sitting up a tree because there's a lion prowling around the bottom, you don't come down the tree just because you got a bit uncomfortable. You actually wait till the lion has gone away and until you're sure the lion's gone away. So, to me, I thought it was very precipitate. When I was down 2 weeks ago, people not social distancing in the chamber, people not following one-way rules in the tea room or sitting too many people at a table in the voting queue, which we call the Rees-Mogg conga, where we have to snake all through the House of Commons and then into the lobbies.
Yes,
very, very few Conservatives wearing masks. I mean, a minority of MPs in total wearing masks and huddling, and often you were ending up backing away because people were coming towards you. So I found the following the rules by MPs quite poor, and indeed some MPs who were mocking you if you were wearing
you found that's absolutely surreal. And tell us a little bit about the state of play on the internal market bill. I saw you give a very eloquent intervention a few days ago, but just talk about the state of play with that right now.
Well, obviously, the Scottish Parliament voted overwhelmingly against giving a legislative consent motion for it yesterday. And the bill is now away to the House of Lords. Mm-hmm. So we need to see what changes they might try to make to diminish some of the real damage in it. But equally, the government had put in some of their own amendments onto the bill that actually emphasize some of the things. So they have actually, from some of the clauses, they have disapplied the Human Rights Act. I mean, normally there's a paragraph on the front of every piece of legislation which says, I, the Secretary of State for whatever, verify that nothing in this bill counteracts the Human Rights Act. And yet here we are with something where it goes, well, we're specifically cutting that out, and we still have the clause that says, notwithstanding anything in domestic or international law. So it's very brazen, but it does the two things. It damages the Northern Ireland Protocol, which is where it breaks international law. That's a treaty that was signed, the withdrawal agreement. And the other thing is the complete hollowing out of devolution after 20 years. And that is just brazen. Absolutely brazen.
My reading on Brexit, a few years ago, I was writing a book on American and UK conservatism. I came across something about a group called Atlantic Bridge. And you may remember Liam Fox had to resign as defense minister because of his association with that. But Atlantic Bridge basically is, I don't know if you've heard of ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council in the United States. They're an absolutely massive, practically every big company belongs to that, and they're a system whereby they're able to basically write the bills and laws that are adopted mostly in the Republican dominated legislatures, of which there are quite a few, and they're behind things like voter suppression, union busting. The list goes on and on. They're funded by the Koch brothers, the whole, and I remember thinking when Atlantic Bridge had to disappear, because it's basically a branch office of ALEC basically. And, but I knew that when it disappeared, that they may have taken away they may have gotten rid of the group, but that those networks still existed. And I was just wondering how it was going to come back. And in my view, I think Brexit is that, because they want. I think that there is a wish to, for the mostly American multinationals to come in and. And so they don't want any standards. They want to be able to privatize everything. And so I see that as a big force behind it, is primarily. Does that make sense? Do you think that's?
I think that's everyone's fear. Obviously in his state visit, Donald Trump talked about everything is on the table, including the NHS, and then was obviously told, oh no, you can't say that, and backpedaled the next day. But if you look, I remember going through some of the trade papers from America a few years back, and they wanted rid of geographical protected indicators, so things like Scotch whiskey, Scotch salmon, Scotch beef. They had a major demand to sell their whiskey as Scotch without the kind of standard rules. Obviously, the stuff like chlorinated chicken and hormone-fed beef, etc. I referred to that in my speech. It's not the issue of the chlorine. You'll swallow more than that in a swimming pool. Mm-hmm. But it's the fact of why things are washed in chlorine. And that's because in certain sectors of American animal husbandry, the standards are poor. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of overcrowding, and they have literally 10 times the incidence of salmonella in chicken than of people infected by salmonella chicken than we do here. So, these are the kind of things the public don't want that. They don't want the standards to go down. But there's also things, and it won't say, the NHS will not be mentioned in an American trade deal. But what it says is full market access. Mm-hmm. So some of the things they're against is central procurement, which Scotland is very good at in the NHS. So we had our own stockpile. We buy, for buying new X-ray machines or CT machines or radiotherapy machines, they they go and they assess it as a group, and that's the make they go for Scotland. So you're buying 7, you're not just buying 1. They don't like that kind of thing. Certainly not central procurement of drugs. And there was an interesting piece, and I can't remember if it was a Newsnight piece or a Panorama or something, or a Dispatches. It was quite a long time ago, might even have been the end of last year, but talking about that basically President Trump was determined that drugs would cost more here. He bizarrely blames the high costs of medicines in America on the fact that because we procure centrally in bulk, we get a better price here. So instead of him thinking about doing something like that, he wants to undermine that here. So you will have, and through the internal market bill, it clearly says the mutual recognition and non-discrimination is that if something, it's painted as if it's to protect products from different parts of the UK. But it very clearly in both the clauses says, or passes through or is imported into any part of the UK, it must be accepted everywhere. So that's one of the things. It also means that we can't set standards here in Scotland. So Scotland banned plastic cotton buds last year, the first country to do that. We wouldn't be allowed to keep. So if there's a company somewhere else in the UK that still makes plastic stemmed cotton buds, we wouldn't be allowed to say they can't be sold. We could say to a Scottish cotton bud producer, you have to follow our rules, but we still wouldn't be able to stop the plastic ones being sold. So we no longer can achieve the thing that we want, but suddenly we are putting an extra burden on our farmers, food producers, whatever it is, but yet we're not achieving the thing that we're actually trying to achieve. And all of that is in there. And the last bit is this one, clause 46. I don't know what number it is now with all the changes. And that is that the UK government takes the right to spend money in all of the devolved areas anywhere in the UK. Now, people are going, oh, isn't that marvellous? How generous. But he who pays the piper calls the tune. Right. So what you're talking about is they would decide what hospital is built, water, electricity, everything. I mean, so the whole big list is almost all of devolution. And what you're talking about is that they will cut out the Scottish Parliament and they will make the financing decisions on investment in Scotland. And you're literally talking about pulling the guts out of devolution.
I've always kind of speculated as to whether, I know that Nicola Sturgeon has met several times with Barnier and they're in communication, but I'm just wondering if there is, a real possibility of no deal Brexit, which would, and this law passes and which pretty much allows the UK government completely disempower, if not abolish, the Holyrood. I mean, how realistic a prospect do you see, and what can Scotland do to defend itself? I know that you're doing everything you can with regard to the bill and trying to pass amendments and stuff like that. But if it really comes down to it, what do you think? How do you think Europe would react? Because of course they've got Northern Ireland as well that they have to be very deeply concerned about. How do you see that? Just in your own experience, how do you see that possibly shaking out?
I think that, obviously the issue with international law and the Northern Ireland Treaty has overshadowed the issues on devolution. And therefore there may well be ordinary people in Europe who don't see that to the same extent. Although I think the issue of the breaking international law, I think even your man or woman in the street in Berlin is conscious of that. There's been a lot of coverage in European and German media around these things. And you see it in the media here, a lot of discussion about that aspect and a bit of a mention about devolution. And, I almost wondered, was it deliberate? I mean, they often do it at budgets, that they put out something so outrageous, everyone gets worked up, and then they pull it at the last minute. And all the other bad stuff goes through because people go, well, it could have been worse. We could have had the granny tax or the pasty tax or whatever it was that they were kind of leading with on that occasion. I mean, there's certainly a lot of sympathy for Scotland within Europe. And I think a lot more understanding. In 2014, I I think most continental Europeans just didn't get what we were on about. Certainly the German side of my family didn't get it at all. I mean, obviously Germany had reunified in 1990, and their view of the UK was kind of very sensible and multicultural and pragmatic and a very nice country. And why would you want to split it up? I mean, my family just didn't get it at all. The morning after the Brexit referendum, the 24th of June 2016, basically they got in touch going, yeah, okay, we get it. You're a different country. And ever since then, I would say there is a lot of recognition of the position we're in. And I think more and more with how the UK government has behaved towards Europe, towards Northern Ireland, but also the people who are more political in Europe and the politicians will be aware of what's being done to devolution. And particularly, a key nation like Germany, where the kind of division of power between the Länder and the Bundestag is very clear. It's in the constitution. There's a constitutional court. And the idea that the Bundestag would trample on, the rights of Bavaria or Nordrhein-Westfalen or something like, I mean, they just wouldn't even contemplate it. So, there's more of an understanding. There's a lot more sympathy. I don't think we're going to have, a major European coming out and going, okay, if you vote yes, we'll take you in 6 months or whatever. But I think what we will get, and what we've already had from Tusk, from Elmar Brok, from Guy Verhofstadt, is I think we will have more leading Europeans being open about being welcoming towards Scotland in an informal way once the UK has finally left, once the transition is over with. I think we will have more of that. And it will be important that we're getting people to understand that there is an open mind for us to come in, because Scotland has a lot to offer Europe.
Absolutely. And you mentioned when we were speaking earlier about your whistleblower bill. I was just wondering, talk a little bit about it. And then what are the prospects for it actually being adopted or passing? It's just like we see just what the circus, so much, the parliamentary procedure is so incredibly complicated. Is that something that could possibly pass, or how do you see it?
We had the second reading on the 25th of September, and that's why I had to go. All right.
Explain a little bit about that, about the first reading, second reading, third.
The first reading was in February, but the first reading isn't a reading. The first reading is you simply say the name of your bill and it's presented to the clerk, and that's it. That's the first reading. So the main debate is what's the second reading. And then it would go to committee where it gets hammered about and you knock all the rough edges off it. And then report stage, the report of the committee, and then the third reading. If it passes, it goes to the Lords. So that's the kind of stages any bill goes through. But the key one is generally around the second reading. Now, the private members' bills are read on a Friday morning between 9:30 and 2:30. The first bill may be able to force a vote and therefore has at least some chance of getting through. If the government don't want it to go through, then they will filibuster it and they will talk it out, and they will have all sorts of people who will stand up and read shopping lists or, recite kind of Shakespeare or whatever you like to fill the time. Because if the minister or a government person or the debate is simply still continuing at 2:30, then there isn't a vote and it falls. With mine, the bill before, actually, a lot of work had been done and the government were supporting it. But it meant that it went through without a vote, but it still only finished at 1:45. So, I had 45 minutes for mine. There's no possibility of having a vote on the second one. Now, we didn't have a lot of people because with COVID, MPs are not generally hanging around Westminster on a Friday, but the people who were there supported it. And that was cross-party. That was Labour, ourselves, the Conservatives. There's a lot of cross-party interest in trying to reform whistleblower legislation because it's disastrous. It's absolutely hopeless. So a lot of support. And then the minister got up and it was basically, we're fine. We don't need to do anything. We have the Public Interest Disclosure Act, which was passed in 1998. Now, that was a private member's bill, and it's always described as if it protects whistleblowers. And one of the problems is that whistleblowers think they are protected by it. And then they discover that, they raise an issue and then all of a sudden they're a troublemaker and they don't get promotion, or they face constructive dismissal and they're driven out of their jobs. About a third of whistleblowers will end up driven out of their jobs. And the bill, PIDA, Public Interest Disclosure Act, the only thing it allows you to do is to go to an employment tribunal against your employer after you have suffered detriment, and to try and get some kind of compensation. And the success rate is 3% of people who actually go all the way to an employment tribunal. So that isn't protection. It isn't just. We've politicians all the time, Jeremy Hunt used to do it all the time, saying how marvelous whistleblowers are, and they come forward and they raise issues and they protect patients. But in actual fact, we don't protect them. And that's what my bill was trying to do, to set up a kind of independent whistleblowers office that would set standards both for companies and the public services, and that then they would be auditing that, and they would also be a place that whistleblowers could go to or be in touch with if they weren't making any progress locally. Now, public services are devolved. So the NHS in Scotland did pass legislation to set up the Independent National Whistleblowers Office, and they have published their standards last year and consulted on them. But obviously everything's a bit held back by COVID. So Scotland is leading in that, but we've not been able to deliver the change because of COVID, but they're at least on the right track.
Okay. I want to get to a couple of the questions from our audience. To the degree of liberty that you wish to discuss this, do the Westminster SNP MPs have any plans to or held any discussions on convening the Scottish Grand Committee?
I mean, that has come up in conversation before. The problem is, in a lot of ways, it's then felt as if that's actually cooperating with what's happening and basically suggesting that the Secretary of State for Scotland and Scottish MPs would make decisions in Westminster for Scotland. So people have put it forward in the past, but there isn't, I wouldn't say there's any particular plans at the moment to go ahead with something like that. Obviously, there's the Scottish Affairs Committee chaired by Pete Wishart, and they've actually done some very good work. I mean, it's not all been on Scotland, but things like drug legislation, where we want to take a public health approach, but the Home Office are not allowing us, which is stupid. I mean, drug deaths and the management of addiction is a challenge everywhere. So why not allow Scotland to pilot some innovative approaches to it, which then Westminster could decide whether they wanted to follow suit later.
Let's see, any plans for strategic changes in the running of our NHS, particularly given the context of Brexit?
Well, not so much strategic. I mean, obviously there need to be preparations. And, I know people are talking about, what if it's a no deal? Actually, the deal the UK government are asking for is already a very hard deal. So there will be bureaucracy, there will be extra costs in importing drugs, exporting drugs, all of these kind of things. So, bringing in radioisotopes, which you can't stockpile, which I've been raising since 2016. So, there'll be a lot of organizational things, but I wouldn't say that it would change the strategic approach to NHS Scotland. I mean, our aim will still be to keep a unified public NHS. But I think what has definitely been recognised in the COVID crisis is the state of care. Now, Scotland is the only UK nation to provide free personal care, and that allows us to keep more people in their own homes. So actually about 2/3 of people getting social care are not in care homes, they're in their own homes. But what it has meant is that people who actually have to be supported in a care home have a really high frailty level. They need a lot of help, or else we'd be supporting them at home. So, our care homes have a very vulnerable population in them, but also they're mostly privately run. Almost 90% of them are privately run, and some of them are very, very expensive. 50,000 a year, this kind of price. So I think that, we've already heard from the the Cabinet Secretary, that there is a plan for a review of social care to look at, actually getting integration to work. It's been Scottish Government policy for 6 years. And some places have done really well, but I think there's a recognition that we need to look at a national care service, and whether that is a national care service separate to the NHS or becomes a national health and care service. That would all come out of the review. So that's probably the biggest strategic change. From my own point of view, what I want to see a difference is a move a little bit away from always focusing on illness and actually focusing on well-being. So we've heard the First Minister talk about the well-being economy. Scotland was the founder of the Wellbeing Economy Government's global group with Iceland and New Zealand. And a lot of our policies, from the baby box to free personal care, are all about the well-being of citizens. So, we have that approach, but I think we still need to get more radical in looking at what gives you health as opposed to how to manage illness. I used to always say it should be called the National Illness Service, but who on earth would want to work in it? So, early years, housing, education, nutrition, these are all the things that actually drive health and well-being. And that's what I would like to see. And we talk about it post-COVID, that we want to build forward, not backwards. We want to, build something better than we came out of. So greener, more circular, more sustainable, but also fairer and more focused on a well-being economy. And to me, that's the clear blue water between staying in the UK and going for independence. It's clear, regardless of what Boris Johnson said the other day, that they will want to go back to business as usual, where the ultra rich are the ones who gain from everything. We don't want to be part of that. We want the chance to actually build a fairer country.
Bruce, on Periscope, how do you manage to work in that theatrical environment with this stupid buffoonery?
Sometimes it's very annoying. I mean, obviously there are times when it's been lighthearted and that's fine. I tend to be part of more serious debates because I'm nearly always talking about, health and illness and so on. So, I'm not usually someone who's cracking lots of jokes. As one of the most senior medics in the house, I'm normally trying to just share my experience, my knowledge, because the depth of knowledge is often quite shallow, considering the decisions that are being made. And sometimes I have been quite shocked at that. But yeah, I mean, a lot of it gets, very annoying. I mean, some of the conventions are tedious. And I mean, even going back to the virtual parliament, for people with a relapsing illness or a disability, even myself, when I had smashed my ankle last autumn, I was being dragged up and down to Westminster in a wheelchair, manhandled off and on planes for 6 weeks. Whereas, with technology, I could have taken part from here. So to me, there's a lot of things that, in a way, have had to be developed that they should hang on to. Every other organization is going, what have we learned from this? What will we go back to? But what will we keep hold of? Whereas they are such traditionalists. They plan to spend billions on refurbishing the parliament, only to basically rebuild a 19th century parliament instead of a 21st century parliament.
If a deal is made by the UK government with the US, will Scotland have to accept the deal if we then become independent?
Oh, not if we become independent, no. Obviously not. Our trade policy would be our own. But I mean, if we're not independent, then anything in any trade deal will be forced on us. But also whether the UK government decides to lower certain standards, cut red tape, as they love to describe it, etc. All of that through the internal market bill would affect us. Simply, it takes away the right of the Scottish Parliament to say these are our standards and regulations, which we have at the moment. And, the UK internal market, which is a completely new name, has survived variation up until now. I mean, one of the bizarre ones they've put in is building regulations. Now, it's not as if you're moving buildings backwards and forwards over the border. But we've got much stricter building regulations. The type of cladding that burnt in Grenfell was not on any of our council houses or social housing. You have to put sprinklers in if a building is 18 metres tall in Scotland. It doesn't have to be put in until it's 30 metres in England. Any material that you're putting on a building needs to be completely fire retardant. And so these kind of things, so safety measures that have evolved in Scotland that we have thought were important, suddenly are being undermined and would only apply to our producers. Well, a builder coming up from England would be allowed to build a house at a much lower standard than a Scottish builder. So all you end up doing, and it becomes a driver to deregulation and a disincentive to set any standard, because that standard is only a burden for your own businesses. It can't stop the bad practice that might come from somewhere else. So unfortunately, that applies whether it's a UK business or whether it's either goods or services coming from America, which is obviously the one we tend to, no offense, Mark, but that's the one we tend to worry about because of their approach to healthcare, the drug pricing, the food standards, etc.
Yeah. Oh, I know, absolutely. In the U.S., I think it was in 2004. There was the thing with drug prices, and but basically in the bill, because there were so many lobbyists and so many millions of dollars being pumped into the coffers of the politicians, they excluded Medicare from being able to negotiate drug prices. I mean, it's just lunacy. But
and that's what they'd be looking to do here. Yeah. I mean, there's NICE in England for England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And in Scotland, we have the Scottish Medicines Consortium, which looks at all the evidence on a drug versus the cost and weighs up whether this new super wonder drug is really a super wonder drug, and is it worth £100,000 a month for the difference it makes. So they make a decision and they will say, no, you can't, or yes, you can. And the part of the US trade demands will be that is gone, and that central procurement of the whole NHS in Scotland is gone. And as I say, it won't mention NHS in that trade deal. It will just talk about full market access on everything.
John Paul Warlow, the thing I'm quite scared of is a lot of my mental health medication comes from Europe. And my concern is what would happen if that medication doesn't come in, as I worry it will make me ill again. And so some ways I'm kind of desperate for us to go our own way.
Well, I think probably most of us on this call are desperate to go our own way for many different reasons. But when I was campaigning in the referendum in 2016, I highlighted there's 5 big health gains that we lose because of Brexit. So one is the workforce, like my German husband, who worked here as a GP for well over 30 years. And yet we've already had a 90% drop in European nurses. The second is medicines that we import. Now, we import and export a similar number. We actually export more to Europe than we import, but they're different. So the UK doesn't make any insulin. It imports all of its insulin. And it's not that won't happen, but the worry is the extra cost on every packet because of the extra bureaucracy, and also the fear in the early part of next year of lorries all being jammed up around Dover, because most medicines come in around kind of Dover, Calais. We're losing our reciprocal healthcare, our little EHIC card that we've all had. The research network. Europe is the biggest medical research and scientific research network in the world. It's bigger than America or China.
America's been in decline in that sense. I mean, in the 50s and 60s, I mean, there was so much money being put into that on basic research. And I don't know if that's...
But it's one of the reasons that we get access to drugs quicker than the likes of Canada and Australia, because the EU is such a huge market. New drugs are launched in America and Europe at a very similar time. The others wait, half a year, even up to 3 years before it's worth the drug company's while to go through all the paperwork and machinations to register and license the drug there. So, all of these things will reduce our access to drugs and increase the cost. I mean, what I would say to our listener is to make sure that you have that conversation with your doctor, looking at where it's coming from. The government asked pharmaceutical firms last year to stockpile 6 weeks of normal drugs, 3 months of insulin. Now, the problem is a lot of these stockpiles have been used up during COVID, and not all of them are easy to restockpile, because obviously there's many parts of the world where drug production is down because of COVID. And the pharmaceutical firms were asked again just recently in the summer to recreate these stockpiles, and have said that is not necessarily possible because we just can't access them. So I think it is worth talking to your doctor about where does it come from? Is it a common drug that's likely to therefore be in the stockpiles? To make sure that particularly, the worst time is going to be the first weeks, because I think it'll be shambolic. I think it'll be chaotic. So is making sure that you've got a prescription, that you've got your drugs for that very, don't just turn up for a prescription in January. Make sure that you have a prescription that will take you through sort of Christmas and January and even into February to get through those initial weeks.
Okay.
But it will add cost, and it will be a cost burden, both importing from the EU, but also if America does drive up drug prices. If we're spending extra millions on drugs, not new drugs, just the drugs we're already using, then that's millions we're not spending on cancer treatment or hip replacements or cataracts. So it's just wasted money. It's not any benefit to patients at all.
Another one, medication related. Why are people's medication getting changed to cheaper versions and are getting told the one they have is unavailable now?
Well, there's probably two issues a little bit tangled in here. There's a thing called generics, which is when a patent has run out. So a new drug is often very expensive for the NHS, and it's most expensive in the early years. And then after a number of years, the patent is finished and other companies can produce the same drug. And they are called generics. So it's not the trade name, it's now a common. So it's like buying Morrison's own baked beans. They're still baked beans. You may like them more, you may like them less, but they're pretty much the same thing. So for the NHS, they're able to save millions of pounds by changing to the generics. And that therefore means we can do something else. One of the other issues, though, that can be happening at the moment is we have had a lot more drug shortages in the last year than we would normally have. There's always some, manufacturing problems, sourcing problems, but there's been a lot more, about 3 or 4 times the number we would expect. And some of that, I think, has been to do with creating stockpiles. There's only 2 ways to create a stockpile. Either you increase production, and that isn't always possible, or you skim a little bit off the top in every day, in every run, and put that in a stockpile. And of course, that action can itself drive a shortage. And the other thing is people who are getting anxious about getting their drugs, kind of creating their own little mini stock. And that can happen anywhere between the factory, the wholesaler, the pharmacist, or the patient. And if all of them are hoarding little bits of drugs just in case, then you create a shortage. So the act of creating stockpiles tends to create shortages. But the underlying principle of changing to generics, that's something the NHS has been doing for 15, 20 years. And that's just, we have to make sure that we're always getting best value for money. And for most patients, the generic drug works just as well. Occasionally, it doesn't agree with them, and then the GP will often look at, well, okay, does the trade one work better for you, or even a different generic? But they do save millions of pounds, which can then be spent on other drugs or other treatments.
Why do you think that the Conservative government wants to withdraw from the European Convention of Human Rights? I mean, what are they not able to do now that they would be able to do if they were no longer bound by the ECHR?
Well, obviously, this came up under Theresa May, and that was her wish to be able to deport, terrorists. It came up with the Abu Hamza case, and obviously she was very angry as Home Secretary that she couldn't just deport him, that even someone like him had rights under the ECHR. And, so they were talking, I mean, even in the 2017 election, talking about having a UK Bill of Rights and leaving that. And then that all toned down because it became clear that the EU were not going to be happy to do a deal if they were leaving the European Convention. Now, that has all come back up again, and they're talking about that they will leave it. And that's part of what then means that the kind of justice and policing and security cooperation can't go ahead. So at the moment, there's a lot of information sharing. There's the European arrest warrant, that if you're stopped for speeding and when they check your name, you're wanted for child abuse in Spain, you get taken there and then on that a European arrest warrant that's out for you. And that opportunity gets lost because we're not going to see that on our police on the beat are not going to see that information because we will no longer be part of any of these systems because we will not guarantee to abide by the Convention of Human Rights. And therefore other countries are going to say, well, we're not having our citizens dragged into this when we can't trust how you're going to behave. In Ireland, the European arrest warrant is used by Northern Ireland police in Southern Ireland, to put out a warrant for someone's arrest. So the chief constable there, the former chief constable, they've been talking about that since 2016, about what an issue it would be if this is lost. So lots of things that we were told, of course we'll do that. Of course we'll remain a member. Of course we will work together. These things are unraveling. So even if there's a deal, it'll be like peace in our time. Boris Johnson will wave his bit of paper, but it's going to be a very thin bit of paper with a huge amount of things that we will still be losing. And still all of that bureaucracy on trade, on our seafood, all of our exports that go to Europe, extra costs on things that are coming into the UK.
How grim could it get? I did a video a couple years ago on what it would mean to leave the EU. Things like airlines not being able to legally take off and land. Of course, the food standards, medical standards, basically impossibility of trading and trucks taking 8 hours to go through Dover rather than just flying on and off. Nobody has a crystal ball and can see, but I mean, how do you see Scotland faring if these worst fears get realized?
Well, obviously, I'm not wanting to frighten people who are listening, and there are people who are aware of this. But I'm on the EU Future Relationship Committee under Hilary Benn and with my colleague Joanna Cherry. And, we heard just a few weeks ago from the Road Haulage Association and kind of, customs experts and so on who are saying the systems are still not there. We're being told they'll be there by the end of December, but we need to train our staff. And obviously, the information that was put out by Michael Gove himself, talking about the delays at Dover and so on, the EU is going to grant certain things because the EU is, in essence, playing the grown-up here and saying, right, okay, your planes can fly, but they can only fly in and out. They can't triangulate. They can't go from London to Bonn to Zurich to London. They can just go one way and back, and that'll be for a certain length of time. And we'll allow some of your lorries to do that. But a lot of our food imports are actually driven by European haulage companies.
Right.
So if they come into the UK and then think that actually their driver could end up spending a day and a half in Kent trying to get back out again, we'd be in danger of them saying, actually, it's a real problem to go there. So, I think it could get really quite chaotic. Mm-hmm. I think that all the players who are involved in that, road haulage and customs, are all trying to get prepared. Mm-hmm. But, here we are in October. We've got 2.5 months until this kicks in. And, the technology is not yet there. The things are not published. So, simply, how do you train your drivers? How do you train people to handle the systems when they still can't see the systems? So I think the very beginning will be quite problematic. Now, the UK government have said for the first 6 months, they're just going to let stuff in. so that food can get in, so that there isn't a problem. But obviously the EU is going to protect its single market. So for exporters, for small companies that export, that'll apply from the 1st of January. Mm-hmm. So, it can be that haulage can get in here. But as I say, if they're going to have to sit for a day and a half to get back onto continental Europe, very quickly, it's a circular trade. So very quickly, you may find haulage firms saying, you know what, we're not doing that.
Also that normally under a no-deal Brexit, even there won't be the reciprocity on recognition of driver's licenses, for example. So, but it's very interesting that we brought this up. What else can you tell us about the way that that the EU is seeing a no-deal Brexit? Because I had these nightmares of just 1st of January, lines of trucks from Dover to Manchester. How do you see the Europeans approaching this?
Well, I think the comments about equivalence and, allowing planes to fly and this kind of thing. I think that what Europe will do, and this is what I think they will do, is that for some of these absolutely lifeline services, they will kind of give a little bit of breathing space and say, right, we're going to recognize this. But it's not going to be how it is now. So, it'll be, are you one of the hauliers who can get one of the certificates to allow you to drive there? But like airplanes, they won't be able to do what's called cabotage. They won't be allowed to take a load to Paris and then pick a load up in Lyon and take something from Paris to Lyon in between to, again, triangulate and make the whole thing economical. They'll be able to go to Paris and either pick something up or deliver something, but they won't be able to kind of do multi-load either to another country or within a country. And a lot of those things just start to make it not good business sense. Right. And that's the problem. So again, your costs go up. Costs will be passing on to us. We may well end up with, lower choices. So all the things, we import something like 40% of our food from Europe. And we've got quite spoilt at, having things all year round, having a wide selection. Some of that may not be there so easily next year.
Finally, we've just got a few minutes left, but in light of the most recent speech by Boris Johnson about refusing any Section 30 order for IndyRef 2, what would be your strategy to ensure that people are given the opportunity to choose independence, basically?
I think it has to be front and center of the manifesto next year. And I think people have to get behind that. I know that people are all talking about, well, let's use our list vote for, one of the brand new parties, etc. I can tell you at Westminster, they never talk about the fact that we have an independent supporting majority in Holyrood. Mm-hmm. It's just, what did the SNP get? And so the worry is if our list vote went away down, they'll go, well, you put independence in your manifesto and, your proportional vote went down to 37. So clearly the Scottish people don't want independence. It's still that the biggest block is not Boris Johnson. The biggest block is that 45% or more of Scots do not yet believe in Scotland as a country with a positive future in its own right. And that's the job that we have to do. And if you start to have bigger and bigger numbers, it puts him on a huge pressure to honour democracy. But then it also does open up other options of saying, right, well, we're taking him to court because, he's obstructing this. But this idea that you don't bother asking him, we'll not bother asking for Section 30 because he said no. We have to make sure that the pressure is on him, because the key thing is we want international recognition and we particularly want European recognition. Mm-hmm. And therefore we have to be seen to have done everything we can to have, if you like, the gold standard independence referendum. That's what we're trying to get. Mm-hmm. And as I say, the more his behavior would get ridiculous and anti-democratic, then the more the international community would kind of go, well, you did your best. We recognize that. And you might reach a point where you've gone to court, Scottish Parliament is calling a referendum, but we have to go through all the steps and push and keep that pressure for a democratic choice on him, not saying, oh, we're just going to go off and do something else.
On that note, I just want to apologize to all our viewers. There were many, many more questions than we were able to address. So I apologize, but I want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us this evening about, turned into be more of a doctor's consultation, rather than constitutional issues. But it was a delightful talking to you.
Well, thanks very much, Mark. And thank you to your viewers, and take care and stay safe.